What would you do if the system that was supposed to protect you turned against you, threatening to strip away everything you've ever known? Michael Hayes didn't have a lawyer, but he had something far more powerful: the truth. And he was about to make them pay for it. The morning sun pierced through the dusty blinds of the old apartment, casting long, slender shadows across the worn wooden floor. Michael Hayes sat at the edge of the bed, eyes fixed on the eviction notice in his trembling hands, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a moment that seemed surreal, something he had never imagined could happen to him, especially after all his mother had fought for. The house had been her dream, her sanctuary, the place where she had built a life and fought tooth and nail to keep it. Now, in an instant, it was slipping away. Just like that, the home where his mother had raised him, the place that held decades of memories, was about to be stolen by the very system his mother had warned him about. But it wasn't just the house at stake. It was the very fabric of his future. Everything was on the line. Michael was no stranger to struggle. Raised in the tough neighborhoods of Chicago, he had seen firsthand how the system worked. He had seen how it chewed up the poor and the powerless, how it tore apart families and left people with nothing but empty promises. His mother, Ella Hayes, had spent her life working two jobs to keep the roof over their heads. She had sacrificed everything for this house. Every dollar she earned, every sleepless night was spent ensuring that their family could hold on to what was rightfully theirs. But now, after her sudden death, Michael was left alone to face the cruel reality of a system designed to destroy him. And yet, there was something inside of him, something deep in his bones, that refused to accept it. The eviction notice in his hand was no simple piece of paper. It was a declaration, a message from the very people who had the power to strip him of everything, to wipe away the history of his family with one swift stroke. It was a blow that would knock anyone down. But Michael Hayes wasn't just anyone. He had fought all his life to survive in a world that constantly told him he didn't belong. But this was different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. It was about standing up against the very forces that had sought to keep him down, the same forces that had driven his mother to exhaustion in her fight to protect their legacy. It was time to face them head on, even if it meant taking on the entire system by himself. He could hear the voices in his head, the doubts that always crept in when things seemed impossible. Who are you to fight this battle? You're just one man against a corporation. You don't have the money. You don't have the resources. You don't even have a lawyer. But as he sat there, staring at the eviction notice, something inside of him clicked. His mother had never given up. She had taught him the value of perseverance, of standing firm in the face of adversity. She had raised him to believe that, no matter how stacked the odds, the fight for what was right was always worth it. And if there was one thing Michael Hayes had learned over the years, it was this: sometimes, fighting the system didn't require a degree in law or a room full of lawyers. Sometimes, it just took a burning determination to expose the truth. His eyes drifted to the photo on the wall, the one of his mother, standing proudly in front of their home, the day she had paid off the mortgage. That moment had been her victory. It had been a symbol of everything they had fought for, and now, here he was, holding a piece of paper that threatened to erase all of that. But Michael wasn't ready to let it go. Not now, not ever. He glanced at the time on his phone, 8:03 a.m. In less than an hour, he would stand in front of a judge who had already made up his mind about people like him. The system wasn't interested in his story. It wasn't interested in justice. It was interested in money, in power, in maintaining the status quo. But Michael had no intention of letting them get away with it. He wasn't going to stand by quietly and let his mother's legacy be taken from him, not without a fight. He grabbed his coat, the fabric frayed from years of wear, and walked out the door, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. He had no lawyer, no legal team, no one to back him up. All he had was a stack of paperwork, a burning desire to expose the truth, and the belief that he could outsmart the system. He didn't know how he was going to do it yet, but he would find a way. He had to. As he made his way to the courthouse, he thought about everything that had brought him here: the injustices, the lies, the ways in which people like him had always been pushed aside. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with resolve. The banks had always preyed on people like him, people who couldn't afford to fight back, people who had to beg for a sliver of fairness in a system that was rigged against them, but not anymore. Michael Hayes wasn't going to beg. He was going to demand justice, and he was going to take it. When he entered the courthouse, the air was thick with tension, as if the very walls knew the power that would be on display today. His heart raced as he walked past the rows of people sitting in the waiting area. He saw them all, victims of the system, people who had been crushed by the weight of bureaucracy, by a system that didn't care about them. But today, it would be different. Today he would stand tall, no matter what. He stepped into the courtroom, the sound of his footsteps bouncing off the marble floor. The judge, Ethan Crawford, sat at the bench, his expression one of disinterest as he glanced over Michael's case. Michael felt the weight of the room shift, the cold eyes of the judge on him, as if to say, "You don't belong here." The same way they had always made him feel. But Michael wasn't here to make them comfortable. He was here to expose the lies, to hold them accountable for the suffering they had caused. He wasn't here to beg for mercy. He was here to win. The judge's voice rang out, harsh and dismissive. "Representing yourself, Mr. Hayes? This should be entertaining," he said, his tone laced with condescension. But Michael didn't flinch. He met the judge's gaze with quiet confidence and said, "I'm not here to entertain, Your Honor. I'm here to win." The court erupted in whispers, some incredulous, some amused. Michael Hayes, a man without a law degree, without the resources to fight the system, was standing in front of them, prepared to take on a billion-dollar corporation. It was a gamble that could end in defeat, but it was a gamble he was willing to take because he had something the banks didn't: the truth. The next few hours passed in a blur of legal jargon, accusations, and thinly veiled threats from the opposing attorney, George Harrington, who seemed to relish every moment of this David versus Goliath battle. Harrington's smirk never left his face, even as Michael laid out the facts, one by one, pulling apart the lies that had been told to justify the foreclosure. With every argument Michael made, with every shred of evidence he presented, the room began to change. The whispers died down, replaced by a sense of unease among the bank's lawyers. They were used to people like Michael backing down, crumbling under the pressure. But Michael wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. As the judge listened, Michael felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could win this. Maybe he could prove that the system wasn't invincible, that no matter how much power, money, or influence the banks had, they were still bound by the law. And when the judge finally spoke, his voice was different, still dismissive, but with a hint of uncertainty. "I'll review the documents," he said, "and we'll reconvene tomorrow." But Michael knew the game had changed. He had planted a seed of doubt in their minds, and he wasn't done yet. As he left the courtroom, his heart raced, but it wasn't fear that propelled him forward. It was determination. He had started a fight that would change everything, and he wasn't about to stop now. He was just getting started. Tomorrow, he would return, and this time, he would make them listen. Michael Hayes felt the weight of the courthouse doors slam shut behind him as he stepped out into the cold morning air. The trial had ended, but in many ways, it felt like it had only just begun. The judge had agreed to review his case, and for the first time in weeks, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. But that hope was fragile. He knew that the real battle wasn't going to be won in the courtroom alone. It would be won in the shadows, in the documents, in the painstaking research he would need to uncover the truth behind the fraud that had taken his family's home. The thought of the task ahead made his heart race. His hands still trembled from the intensity of the trial, but there was a fire inside of him, burning hot and fierce. His mother's house, their legacy, was on the line. The weight of generations rested on his shoulders, and he would not let it be taken away by a corrupt system that cared nothing for the people it trampled. He had already begun to understand one crucial truth. In order to fight this system, he had to outthink it. It wasn't enough to show up and make a case. He had to expose every crack, every flaw, and twist every legal loophole to his advantage. His first stop was the local library. It had become his refuge over the past few weeks, his sanctuary of knowledge in the midst of the chaos that threatened to swallow him whole. The library had always been a quiet place for reflection, but now it had become his battleground. The yellowing pages of foreclosure law books felt like the only allies he had left. He had to become his own lawyer, his own advocate. No one else was going to fight for him, not the way he needed them to. As he walked past the rows of bookshelves, his eyes scanned the titles: banking laws, property rights, legal precedents. Each title felt like another piece of armor he could add to his arsenal. But it wasn't just about learning the laws. It was about understanding how the system had failed him and so many others. He needed to uncover the evidence, solid, undeniable proof that would expose the fraud and force the system to listen. Michael sat at a worn table, his laptop open in front of him, the clicking of the keys echoing through the quiet room. The weight of his purpose was palpable. This wasn't just about winning a case. This was about changing the system that had allowed the wealthy and powerful to crush people like him without consequence. The first thing he searched for was the name of the bank, First Union. The more he researched, the more he found. Their practices were shocking, but not surprising. He discovered that First Union Bank had a long history of aggressive foreclosure tactics. They targeted low-income families, particularly in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods. They had a playbook, one that involved forging signatures, falsifying mortgage documents, and rushing families into foreclosure before they even had a chance to contest it. This wasn't just one mistake, one clerical error. This was a pattern of behavior, a deliberate strategy to steal homes from the most vulnerable people. Michael's stomach churned with every new revelation. But even as the truth became clearer, he knew that the battle was just beginning. He needed more. He needed documents, hard, undeniable proof that would connect the dots and show the court that this was no mere oversight or error. This was fraud. He had already gathered the second mortgage agreement, the one with the forged signature, but he needed something more. Something that would show the bank's intent. The system would not be moved by mere documents. It would only respond to a crushing blow. Michael's thoughts turned to the notary, the one who had witnessed his mother's second mortgage agreement. He had already suspected something was off about the document, but now he had to confirm it. The notary's name was Angela Ford, a woman who had worked in the local area for years. He wasn't sure if she would be willing to help him, but he had no other choice. He had to find her. His phone buzzed in his pocket as he stood up from the table. It was a message from his friend and former co-worker Brian. He hadn't spoken to Brian in weeks, not since he'd lost his job at the community center. But when Brian found out about the foreclosure, he had offered to help however he could. "Michael, I've got something for you," the message read. "Come by the community center. I found something that might help." Michael's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The break he had been waiting for. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, his mind racing. When he arrived at the community center, Brian was waiting for him, a folder clutched tightly in his hands. He led Michael to a back office, away from prying eyes. "I dug through some old files from when I worked at the bank," Brian said, his voice low. "I found something that's going to change everything." Michael's breath caught as Brian opened the folder. Inside were copies of internal emails, memos, and notes, documents that detailed the systematic targeting of homeowners in neighborhoods like Michael's. The emails were damning. They confirmed what Michael had suspected all along. First Union Bank wasn't just guilty of a few mistakes, they were orchestrating an entire campaign to seize homes from the poor and disenfranchised. But there was more. Hidden deep in the files was a memo that referenced Michael's mother's mortgage. It was signed by the same people who had authorized the second mortgage agreement, the one with the forged signature. The memo included a note about expedited foreclosure procedures for certain high-risk properties. Michael's stomach twisted as he read the words. His mother's property had been flagged as a high-risk property, one that had been targeted for quick foreclosure. The memo was clear. They knew what they were doing. They knew his mother's signature had been forged, but they pushed the foreclosure through anyway. Brian leaned forward, his voice shaking. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this stuff, Michael. The bank's already on to me. If they find out I've been snooping, I could lose everything. But I couldn't just let them get away with it." Michael felt the weight of Brian's words. This was it, the evidence he needed. He now had the smoking gun that could bring the entire case crashing down. But there was still one more piece to find. He needed to track down Angela Ford, the notary who had witnessed the second mortgage agreement. If she could confirm that she hadn't actually witnessed the signing, it would be the final nail in the coffin for First Union. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and searching. Michael spent hours combing through public records, trying to track down Angela Ford. He found her address, an apartment on the outskirts of the city, and made his way there one evening, heart pounding in his chest. When he knocked on her door, the woman who answered was older, with graying hair and a tired look in her eyes. She seemed startled to see him, but let him in after he explained who he was. "I know this is a lot to ask," Michael began, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table. "But I need your help. I need to know if you notarized a second mortgage agreement for my mother, the one they used to foreclose on her property." Angela Ford's face went pale as she looked at the papers Michael laid out before her. She hesitated for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the documents. "I don't remember," she said quietly. "I'm sorry, but I don't remember witnessing your mother sign anything." Michael felt his heart stop. It was the confirmation he had been waiting for. Angela continued, her voice low and ashamed. "I remember the day someone came into my office with the documents. They said your mother couldn't come in because she was ill. They told me it was just a formality. I trusted them. I never thought to question it." Michael felt a wave of anger and frustration wash over him, but he fought to keep his composure. "That was a lie," he said. "They knew what they were doing. They forged her signature." Angela's eyes filled with tears. "I never wanted to be part of something like this. I didn't know." Michael stood up, feeling a deep sadness for her. "You didn't know, but now you do. And I need you to testify. I need you to tell the court what you've just told me. Your testimony could stop them from doing this to anyone else." Angela hesitated, fear clouding her face. "If I testify, they'll come after me," she whispered. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They can't win if we stand together. We have to fight this." As Michael left Angela's apartment that evening, the weight of what was ahead seemed to settle in his chest. He had the evidence. He had the witnesses. He had everything he needed to take down First Union Bank. But the fight was far from over. He had made enemies in high places, and he knew that they wouldn't back down easily. They would come after him, and they would come after anyone who helped him. But Michael was ready. For his mother, for his family, for everyone who had ever been crushed by the weight of a system that had failed them, he would not stop. Not until the truth was exposed. Not until justice was served. As he walked through the darkened streets of the city, Michael Hayes knew one thing for sure. He had just begun to fight. For Michael Hayes, the turning point had arrived. It wasn't just the evidence he had gathered. The papers, the emails, the sworn testimony. No, it was more than that. It was the quiet, undeniable force building inside him, the energy that had been lacking for so long. He was no longer just a man trying to stop a foreclosure. He was fighting for something much bigger than that. He was fighting for justice, for accountability, for the thousands of people whose lives had been wrecked by the very system he now sought to expose. The morning after Michael met with Angela Ford, the notary who had confirmed the forgery, he woke up with a feeling that he hadn't had in weeks: hope. It was a fragile thing, but it was there. Hope, like a small flame flickering in the dark, beginning to burn brighter with every step he took toward the truth. He had the smoking gun, the testimony from Angela Ford, the internal bank memos, the evidence of fraud. He had already sent the new evidence to his lawyer, and now it was time to prepare for the court hearing. The pressure was suffocating, but Michael had a resolve in his chest that was stronger than any fear. His mother's house, the legacy she had fought for, was on the line. But more than that, Michael had come to understand that this battle was bigger than one house. It was about exposing a corrupt system that preyed on people like him, and like so many others who didn't have the resources to fight back. Each new piece of evidence Michael uncovered felt like a new weapon in his hands, something that would help him break through the barriers the bank had built. The more he uncovered, the more the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, but he wasn't naive. He knew that the bank wouldn't just let him win, not without a fight. This system had worked for them for years, and it wasn't about to be dismantled by a man with no legal training and a handful of documents. They would retaliate. He knew it. But this time, it wasn't going to be enough to intimidate him into silence. He was no longer alone in this fight. Brian, his former co-worker at the community center, had become an unlikely ally in the war against First Union Bank. Brian had risked his own job and safety to help Michael gather the evidence from within the bank. He had dug through old files, emails, and internal memos, and he had uncovered the ugly truth about the bank's practices. For weeks, Brian had been helping Michael navigate the complexities of the case, offering his knowledge and support when it seemed like no one else would. Now, it was time to take the fight to the courthouse. But even as Michael walked through the steps of filing his case, he knew that the legal battle was only a small part of the war. It was the people who stood behind him, who offered their knowledge and their courage, who would ultimately make the difference. The Justice Collective, the group of activists and lawyers who had offered to help Michael, had begun to mobilize. They had put together a team, one that would work tirelessly to expose the corruption within First Union Bank. This wasn't just Michael's fight anymore. It was a movement that would spark something much larger. The night before the hearing, Michael sat alone in his small apartment, the weight of the case heavy on his shoulders. He had spent hours reviewing the documents, making sure every detail was perfect. He wasn't just going to present the evidence, he was going to present a story. A story that would show the bank's malice, the blatant disregard they had for the people they had sworn to serve. The story would expose the fraud in a way that left no room for doubt. The clock on the wall ticked slowly as Michael sat at his kitchen table, staring at the papers laid out before him. He could almost feel the weight of each document, the truth pressing against his fingers. He thought about his mother, about the sacrifices she had made to keep their home, to build a life that was meant to last. She had trusted the system, believed that the law would protect them. But it hadn't. Instead, they had been swept aside like so many others, caught in a system that existed to enrich the powerful and leave the rest of them behind. But now, Michael had a plan, and for the first time in a long while, he had the power to follow through with it. The day of the hearing arrived, and Michael could feel the nervous energy in his bones as he entered the courtroom. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was something else, something deeper, something more powerful than fear. It was the determination to see this fight through, no matter the cost. He had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, he knew that this wasn't just about proving a point. It was about taking down the system that had abused so many people for so long. As he took his seat, he looked around the courtroom. There was no sign of the usual quiet reverence. People were whispering to each other, journalists were flipping through their notepads, and the air was thick with tension. Michael had no illusions about what he was up against. First Union Bank had an army of lawyers, of lobbyists, of connections in high places. And Judge Crawley, well, Michael wasn't sure what to expect from him anymore. He had already seen the judge's indifference in the earlier hearings, but this time would be different. This time, Michael had the truth on his side. The doors to the courtroom opened, and the bank's legal team filed in. Bryce Lambert, the bank's lead attorney, walked in with the same smug expression he had worn the first time they met. But this time, there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, a hint of unease. Darren Klein, the branch manager who had been so dismissive of Michael in their earlier interactions, followed close behind. The two of them exchanged a look before taking their seats at the plaintiff's table. Michael noticed the way their eyes darted around the room, as though they were searching for something, some sign of weakness they could exploit. But there was no weakness in Michael now. As the hearing began, Michael could feel the weight of the moment. The judge's gavel came down and Judge Crawley addressed the court. "We are here today to address the defendant's motion regarding the foreclosure proceedings. Mr. Hayes, you may present your case." Michael stood up, his legs a little unsteady, but his voice was clear. "Your Honor, I am not here to waste anyone's time. I'm here because a grave injustice has been done. My family's home has been stolen through fraudulent means, and I intend to prove it. I have the evidence to show that First Union Bank knowingly falsified documents, rushed through foreclosure procedures, and lied about the legitimacy of my mother's mortgage." For the first time, Judge Crawley seemed to lean forward. His attention peaked. Michael continued, each word carrying the weight of his determination. He spoke of the forged signatures, the missing endorsements, the emails that revealed a pattern of targeting minority homeowners. He spoke of Angela Ford's testimony, of the bank's attempts to cover up their actions. And as he spoke, he could see something in the judge's eyes, a flicker of recognition. Maybe it was the weight of the evidence, or maybe it was the undeniable passion in Michael's voice. But whatever it was clear that the tide had started to turn. When Michael finished, he looked directly at Bryce Lambert. The smug expression that had once defined him was now gone. In its place was a look of uncertainty, of discomfort. The bank's legal team was silent, unsure of how to respond. The judge's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Lambert, your response?" Lambert stood up slowly, but his voice was different now, hesitant, defensive. "Your Honor, we acknowledge that there may have been some minor discrepancies in the paperwork, but this is standard procedure. The foreclosure process was followed by the book." Michael could see through the lie. He had the documents. He had the proof. But the real turning point came when he showed the courtroom the emails, the ones that showed how the bank had intentionally targeted homes like his, knowing that the owners couldn't afford to fight back. He showed the emails that referenced the expedited foreclosure procedures, the instructions to ignore the missing signatures, and the deliberate attempts to bypass normal protocols. The room was silent as the evidence sank in. Michael could see the shift. It wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about right and wrong. And for the first time, the people in that room saw it too. The bank was guilty. And Michael wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. After hours of tense back and forth, Judge Crawley finally banged his gavel. "This court will conduct a full review of the foreclosure process," he said. "The stay on the foreclosure remains in effect, and Mr. Hayes will retain possession of the property until further notice." It wasn't a complete victory yet, but it was a monumental step forward. The tide had shifted. Michael had gained momentum and the bank had been exposed. The first real blow had been struck and there was no going back now. As Michael left the courtroom, his heart was heavy, but there was a sense of triumph in his chest. This was just the beginning. The battle wasn't over, but he had won the first round, and he would fight to the bitter end, no matter what it cost. The system had underestimated him, and now Michael Hayes had the momentum to make them pay. The moment Michael Hayes had waited for had arrived. His victory in the courtroom had been bittersweet. It wasn't a definitive win, but it was a powerful blow to the establishment that had sought to crush him and his family. The stay on the foreclosure had given him temporary relief, but deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The fight he was now engaged in was more than about one house. It was a battle to expose the cracks in a system that had allowed the powerful to prey on the vulnerable. This was a war against the system itself. The bank was not a group of people who could be easily intimidated. It was a corporation with an immense web of influence, and it had no intention of rolling over just because one man had dared to challenge it. Michael's victory in court had sent shockwaves through the legal and financial circles, and now the system was tightening its grip on him. The court hearing was only the opening salvo. It was clear that the bank would not let him go without a fight. The next few days were the hardest Michael had ever faced. The victory he had so desperately sought came at a cost. His phone had begun to ring relentlessly. Calls from numbers he didn't recognize, messages from people he didn't know, messages that were increasingly aggressive. The first was an email, simple but chilling. "You've made a dangerous enemy." The second, a more personal note, came with a picture of his mother's house, photographed from the street. No caption, no words, just an unsettling image. It was a warning. And then the call started. Late one evening, Michael was sitting in his small, dimly lit apartment, staring at the stack of documents on the table. His fingers were trembling as he scrolled through the files on his laptop, absorbing every piece of information, every piece of evidence. He had learned more about the bank's practices in the past few weeks than most lawyers would in a lifetime, and still, the feeling of impending danger hung over him like a dark cloud. He had made it this far, but the real challenge was just beginning. A knock on the door startled him. The last few days had blurred together, long hours, stressful meetings, and constant phone calls. So when he opened the door, the last thing he expected to see was Angela Ford standing there. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She handed him a folder before he could say a word. "They know," Angela whispered, her voice barely audible. "They know everything." Michael took the folder, his heart pounding. Inside were more documents, newly forged, with signatures that were eerily similar to his mother's, documents that had not been present in his earlier findings. Angela explained how, after the court hearing, someone had visited her at work, pressuring her into silence. She had already lost her job and feared for her safety, but now the stakes had escalated. "They're going to destroy you, Michael," Angela said, her voice breaking. "They've already started, and if you keep going, they'll go after everyone you've spoken to, your friends, your family, the people who are helping you. None of us are safe." Michael stood motionless for a moment, processing her words. The battle had just escalated, and now it wasn't just about saving his mother's house. It was about survival. The bank was not content to fight within the confines of the law. It would resort to every dirty trick in the book. Threats, intimidation, manipulation. They were pulling out all the stops, hoping that he would crack under pressure. But Michael had learned something crucial over the past few months. He wasn't the one they needed to fear. The system was the one at fault, and he was simply the one daring to expose it. The next few days were a blur of meetings and frantic phone calls. The Justice Collective had mobilized, their resources now focused on the next phase of the fight. They weren't going to let Michael face this alone. They understood that the case was no longer just about a house. It was a fight for the future. If Michael could prove the systemic corruption in the way the bank had handled his case, it could open the door for thousands of others who had been wronged in the same way. But with each passing day, the threats grew more severe. One evening, after leaving a meeting with his legal team, Michael's car was broken into. His laptop, full of sensitive files, was stolen. The police shrugged it off as a random break-in, but Michael knew better. This wasn't just a robbery. It was an attempt to cripple his case, to prevent him from moving forward. The bank was making it clear. They would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Desperation clawed at him, but as he sat in his car, staring at the empty space where his laptop had been, something inside him hardened. They thought they could break him, that they could silence him by taking away his resources. But Michael had something far more powerful than any document or piece of technology. He had the truth, and the truth, once set free, would be unstoppable. He spent hours poring over the evidence, cross-referencing it, looking for any new angles, any new leads. It was in those late-night hours that he found the breakthrough he needed. A discrepancy in the original loan transfer, the very transfer that had made the foreclosure legal in the first place. A missing endorsement. That small technicality, buried in the paperwork, was the key to unraveling the whole case. If he could prove that the transfer was invalid, the entire foreclosure process would be illegal. The bank would have no standing to claim the property. But even as he celebrated this small victory, another message arrived. This time, it wasn't a warning or a threat. It was a personal attack, a video sent to his phone, showing him leaving the courthouse from the last hearing. The voice on the recording was clear. "If you don't back down now, we'll make sure you lose everything. Your house, your career, your future, everything." Michael watched the video in silence, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. This wasn't a game to the bank. They were playing for keeps, and they were willing to destroy anyone who stood in their way. But Michael was done backing down. He stood tall, no longer consumed by fear. The fight was too important, the stakes too high. He had already lost so much: his job, his savings, his peace of mind. But he had his integrity, his family's legacy, and the unwavering support of those around him. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight for justice, for truth, for the people who had been trampled under the weight of a corrupt system. The next day, as he walked into the courthouse, Michael was ready. He had gathered everything he needed: the missing endorsement, the evidence of the bank's malfeasance, and the testimony of those who had dared to stand with him. The Justice Collective was with him, and the media attention had grown into a full-scale movement. The courtroom was filled with journalists, activists, and curious onlookers. This wasn't just a case about one man anymore. It was a case about the system itself, about whether or not the powerful could continue to exploit those without the means to defend themselves. Inside the courtroom, Bryce Lambert was waiting, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a sharp tension. Darren Klein sat beside him, his face drawn and anxious. They knew the truth was coming, and they knew it would destroy them. The hearing was tense. The judge, Judge Crawley, took his seat, his eyes flickering over the papers in front of him. Michael stood firm, the weight of the moment pressing on him, but his voice didn't tremble. He presented his case, step by step, with precision and clarity, laying out the full extent of the bank's corruption. The missing endorsement, the forged signatures, the deliberate attempts to sidestep legal requirements, all of it was laid bare. As Michael spoke, he could see the room shift. The atmosphere changed. People were no longer just listening, they were absorbing. The bank's lawyers, once confident and smug, were now on the defensive. Judge Crawley, who had been dismissive in the past, now seemed to be paying closer attention. The battle was no longer just about the house, it was about exposing a system that had failed, that had allowed the rich and powerful to control the lives of ordinary people. Michael was no longer just a man fighting for his home, he was a man fighting for justice. And this time, the system wasn't going to get away with it. As the hearing drew to a close, Michael's heart raced. He had done everything he could. The evidence was overwhelming. The truth had been spoken, and now it was in the judge's hands. But Michael knew that the fight wasn't over. The bank would fight back harder than ever. They would try to use every trick in the book to destroy him. But Michael was ready for whatever came next. This battle had only just begun. As he walked out of the courthouse, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from the Justice Collective. "We've got your back. Keep fighting." And that was all Michael needed to hear. He wasn't alone. He wasn't fighting just for his family's home anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been wronged by a system that didn't care about them. The battle was intensifying, but Michael was ready. He would not back down, not now, not ever. The morning of the final court hearing was colder than usual. Michael Hayes stood outside the courthouse, the sharp autumn air biting through his worn jacket. He had been here before, many times now. His body was tired from the relentless pressure, his mind weary from sleepless nights spent studying legal texts, gathering evidence, and strategizing with his legal team. But today felt different. Today there was a sense of finality in the air, as though everything that had come before had led to this one moment. Michael had taken on the system and survived. But would he win? The courtroom was already buzzing with anticipation. The news had spread. Journalists, activists, and community members had gathered to witness the culmination of Michael's fight for justice. It was more than a legal battle now. It was a fight for something far greater. It was about holding the powerful accountable. It was about dismantling the system of corruption that had been built to crush people like him, people who were too poor, too disempowered to challenge it. Michael had become more than just a defendant in a foreclosure case. He had become a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced and oppressed for too long. As he entered the courtroom, his eyes scanned the room. Bryce Lambert sat at the bank's table, his expression tense, betraying a rare crack in the calm, controlled demeanor he had maintained throughout the case. Darren Klein, the branch manager who had been the face of the bank's deceit, looked uneasy, his usual smug confidence replaced by nervous glances toward his colleagues. Michael felt the weight of their gaze upon him. He knew they were trying to remain composed, but deep down, they knew what was coming. They had underestimated him from the start. And now, it was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. Judge Crawley entered, his robe sweeping behind him as he took his seat. The room fell into silence. This was it, the moment of truth. Michael had fought tooth and nail for every inch of this case. His victory had not come easy, but now, in the final stretch, the pieces were falling into place. For months, Michael had been living in a state of constant anxiety, unsure of whether he would be able to hold on to his mother's home. But now, as he stood before the judge, it was clear that the tide had turned. He wasn't just fighting for his family's house anymore. He was fighting for a system that had failed countless others, a system that prioritized profit over people. He was fighting for the many families who had been crushed by the weight of corporate greed, who had been kicked out of their homes for reasons beyond their control. They had all been victims of a broken system, and Michael had made it his mission to expose that corruption to the world. The hearing began, and as the attorneys for First Union Bank made their arguments, Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. They were still trying to claim that the foreclosure process had been lawful, that everything had been done by the book. But Michael knew better. He had spent sleepless nights poring over legal documents, cross-referencing the bank's filings with his own research. He had found the inconsistencies, the forgeries, the deliberate missteps that had allowed the bank to wrongfully foreclose on his mother's home. and he had the evidence to back it up. The endorsement that had been missing from the mortgage transfer, the forged signatures, the lies that had been used to justify the eviction. All of it was laid out before the judge, undeniable and damning. Judge Crawley listened carefully as Michael's legal team presented the evidence. The judge's expression remained neutral, but Michael could see a flicker of something in his eyes. For the first time, Judge Crawley was truly considering the weight of the case. The bank had made a mistake by thinking that they could bully Michael into submission. They had underestimated his intelligence, his determination, and his ability to fight back against the system. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he stood tall, his voice steady as he addressed the court. He spoke with the conviction of a man who knew he was on the right side of history, who had seen the corruption of the system up close and had refused to accept it. He didn't just talk about the foreclosure, he talked about the bigger picture, the way the system had been rigged to benefit the powerful while punishing the vulnerable. He talked about how his fight was not just for him, but for everyone who had been unfairly targeted, for everyone who had been treated like they didn't matter. His words echoed in the room, striking a chord with everyone who was listening. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a fight for justice, for dignity, for the future. The moment of reckoning had come. The bank's attorneys tried to fight back, to downplay the evidence, to dismiss it as insignificant. But they couldn't ignore the truth. They couldn't erase the reality of what had been done. The courtroom was filled with reporters, their cameras flashing as they documented the proceedings. This was no longer just a courtroom drama, it was a spectacle, and Michael was winning. As the judge deliberated, the tension in the room was palpable. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He had done everything he could. He had fought for what was right, no matter the cost, and now it was out of his hands. He had to trust that the judge would see the truth for what it was, that he would acknowledge the corruption and hold the bank accountable. Finally, Judge Crawley spoke. His voice was measured, but the words he spoke were like a thunderclap in the courtroom. The evidence presented in this case has shown clear violations of the law. The bank's actions were not only illegal, but intentionally deceptive. The foreclosure of Michael Hayes' home will be nullified. The bank will be required to return the property to its rightful owner. The room erupted in a collective gasp. Michael's knees almost buckled beneath him as the weight of the decision settled over him. He had won. Against all odds, he had won. His mother's home, his family's legacy, was safe, but the victory didn't come without its costs. Michael knew that the fight was far from over. The bank, now publicly humiliated, would not go down without a fight. There would be appeals, there would be more tactics to intimidate him, to wear him down. The battle for his mother's house had ended, but the war against the system was just beginning. As Michael walked out of the courtroom, the sun was setting behind him, casting a golden glow over the city. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. He had done it. He had exposed the truth. He had fought for what was right, and he had won. But even in his triumph, he knew that this victory was just the beginning. Michael's story would go on to inspire countless others. People who had been told that they couldn't fight, that they were too small, too powerless to make a difference. Michael had proven that the system was not invincible. It could be challenged, it could be beaten, and it could be changed. And for Michael Hayes, this was not just a victory, it was a transformation. The man who had walked into that courtroom as a defendant had left as a champion. The power of legal genius, the ability to see through the lies, to uncover the truth, to fight back, had turned the tide. And now, Michael knew that he had a responsibility. He couldn't stop here. His story had become a symbol of hope for those who had been silenced for too long. And as he stood on the courthouse steps, the weight of his journey heavy on his shoulders, he knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning of a much larger fight. Michael Hayes's journey had been one of resilience, intellect, and unwavering determination in the face of an overwhelming system. His battle against First Union Bank's wrongful foreclosure of his mother's home had started as a personal fight, but it soon grew into something far more profound. A fight against systemic corruption, corporate greed, and the exploitation of the powerless. In the end, Michael's victory was not just about keeping his family's legacy, it was about exposing the truth, standing up to injustice, and showing the world that even one person, armed with knowledge and persistence, could take on the powerful and win. The story of Michael Hayes began with what seemed like a crushing blow. The bank's wrongful foreclosure of his mother's home, a place filled with memories and significance, was the beginning of his descent into a nightmare. But what might have broken anyone else only hardened Michael's resolve. While others might have succumbed to fear or helplessness, Michael chose to dig deeper, to search for the truth. He didn't have a law degree, he didn't have the resources to hire an attorney, but he had something that many others overlooked: a deep understanding of what was right and a refusal to back down. From the moment he received that eviction notice, Michael knew something wasn't right. He had inherited his mother's house, a home that had been passed down for generations. She had worked tirelessly to pay off the mortgage, and when she died, she believed it was finally hers, free and clear. But the eviction notice proved otherwise. Michael soon discovered a forged second mortgage agreement, one that his mother had never signed, and it was this discovery that set the stage for a battle that would not only change his life, but would also shine a light on the darker corners of the financial system. The most compelling part of Michael's journey was not just his ability to uncover the fraud, but his unyielding pursuit of justice in the face of a system designed to keep people like him down. He faced rejection after rejection, first from the bank, which dismissed his claims outright, then from lawyers who refused to take on his case, and even from the legal aid office that turned him away. But Michael refused to accept defeat. Instead, he became his own lawyer, studying legal texts late into the night, learning about mortgage law, fraud, and the very system that had tried to crush him. As the battle unfolded, the stakes grew higher. Michael had not only uncovered the fraudulent documents, but had learned that his mother's mortgage had been passed through several hands, each transfer lacking the proper endorsements, each document forged or mishandled. Armed with this knowledge, Michael filed a series of motions in court, challenging the bank's authority to foreclose on the house. Each motion was met with resistance, but Michael refused to back down. When his case was dismissed by the judge, he appealed, armed with even more evidence, including the testimony of a notary who had been coerced into falsifying a document. He didn't just fight for his house. He fought for the truth, for justice, for every person who had been wronged by the system. The turning point came when Michael's persistence paid off. In court, the judge, who had initially seemed indifferent to his case, began to take notice of the evidence. The turning tide came when Michael revealed a crucial piece of the puzzle: the missing endorsement on his mother's mortgage transfer, and the court was forced to take action. The bank had no legal standing to foreclose, and Judge Crawley, finally convinced of Michael's claims, granted him a temporary stay on the foreclosure. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless, and it marked the beginning of the end for First Union Bank's fraudulent actions. But the battle was far from over. Michael's courage, intelligence, and determination had exposed the cracks in the bank's facade, but the institution was not going to let him win without a fight. The retaliation was swift. Michael's bank account was frozen, his car was repossessed, and his utilities were cut off. The intimidation tactics were meant to break him, to make him give up. But Michael didn't flinch. He dug deeper, gathering more evidence, learning more about the bank's shady practices. His legal motions, filed one after another, finally caught the attention of the media. The public became aware of the corruption at the heart of the bank's foreclosure practices, and the pressure began to mount on the bank to comply. Then came the final hearing. The evidence was undeniable. Michael presented the missing endorsement, the forged signatures, and the video footage of bank executives discussing their plan to rush foreclosures through the system. The media swarmed the courthouse, and the public was watching. It wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a public spectacle, and Michael was winning. Judge Crawley had no choice but to rule in his favor. The foreclosure was nullified. Michael's victory was a triumph of knowledge, persistence, and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. But Michael's victory was not just a personal one, it had a ripple effect. The bank was exposed for its fraudulent practices, and the system that had been set up to protect the wealthy and powerful was revealed for what it truly was. The legal system, which had failed so many before him, was forced to take notice of the injustice. And Michael's story became a beacon of hope for others who had been oppressed and silenced. It showed them that, no matter how big or powerful the enemy might be, it was possible to fight back. It showed them that one person, armed with determination and the pursuit of justice, could change the system. The lessons from Michael's journey are profound. The most important lesson is that knowledge is power. Michael was not a lawyer, but he learned the law. He understood how the system worked and used that knowledge to his advantage. He didn't rely on anyone else to fight his battle. He took ownership of it himself. This is a lesson that everyone can apply to their own lives. We are all capable of learning and growing, of understanding the systems that affect us, and of using that knowledge to make a difference. Whether it's in the courtroom, in the workplace, or in our personal lives, knowledge empowers us to make informed decisions, to advocate for ourselves, and to stand up to injustice. Another key lesson is the power of perseverance. Michael faced rejection, intimidation, and setbacks at every turn. The bank tried to bury him with paperwork, tried to break him financially, and even resorted to harassing him. But he never gave up. He kept pushing forward even when the odds seemed insurmountable. This persistence is something we can all apply to our own lives. Success rarely comes easily, and the path to justice or success is often filled with obstacles. But if we keep moving forward, if we keep fighting, we increase our chances of achieving our goals. Finally, Michael's story is a testament to the power of standing up for what is right. The system that Michael faced was rigged to favor the rich and powerful, but he refused to accept the status quo. He fought for fairness, for his family's legacy, and for the truth. He understood that even though the system was flawed, it could still be changed. His story reminds us that the fight for justice doesn't end in the courtroom. It continues in our communities, in our workplaces, and in our everyday lives. When we stand up for what is right, we inspire others to do the same. We create a ripple effect that can lead to real, lasting change. Now, as you reflect on Michael's journey, think about how you can apply these lessons in your own life. What systems are you up against? What battles are you fighting? Remember, you have the power to change things, to stand up for what is right, and to keep pushing forward no matter how difficult the journey might seem. As you've watched Michael's story unfold, I hope you've been inspired by his perseverance, his intelligence, and his unwavering commitment to justice. His fight is a reminder that no one is truly powerless, and that change is possible when we refuse to give up. If you've enjoyed Michael's story and want to support more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps us going and motivated to continue bringing you more powerful stories like the one you've just heard. Together, we can keep fighting for justice, one story at a time. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you in the next video.